Parchment. That's what the Constitution is written on. It's raw animal skin, stretched and dried under tension. It's it's a really gross and messy process. It's bloody at first, dirty. It's exhausting to scrub the poop and the pee and the blood and the guts off of that animal skin. It's physically demanding. You're soaking and scrubbing and yanking on this animal grossness, but over time, that raw and gross process, it gets refined. It gets smoothed. Parchment is stronger than paper. It has durability like leather. It doesn't tear. Over time, it doesn't crumble to dust. And part of what makes it so strong is that it has a little bit of give to it. It vibrates and bends and rebounds, and it's the same material as the head of a drum. It's the year 1776 when the colonies decide to cut their ties from Great Britain. They write out the Declaration of Independence on a, you guessed it, piece of parchment. And what they say in that declaration is basically, we believe that all men are created equal and have a right to life, liberty, and in this case, the pursuit of happiness. So when a government, and in this case, England or Great Britain, starts to destroy those rights, then the people, and in this case, us, the colonists, the people living in the colonies, we should be able to overthrow that government and start a new country of our own. Shout out social contract theory. Shout out Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Mr. John Locke. So then they go on to list all the reasons that King George III of Great Britain has been a tyrant, that has been an absolute leader ruling with tyranny and tyrannical orders. Remember the quote from Lord Acton, ladies and gentlemen, power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. King George III has denied the colonies representation. He's tried to keep the people from being able to immigrate there. He bribes judges. He doesn't let the colonists have trial by jury. He's cut the colonies off from trading with the rest of the world, and they say he has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the everyday lives of our people. So they fight for that freedom. And the Revolutionary War rages on for several years, all the way up until 1783. And in 1783, America has a definitive win and gets their independence from Great Britain. Not long after the war ends, challenges and disputes rise up, and questions start cropping up amongst the 13 states. Questions about their relationships to one another, questions about how much power states should have versus how much power the federal government or the central government should have. Can Rhode Island really tax anybody who crosses over into their land and crosses over their streets with their horses and buggies? Does the Potomac River really belong to Maryland, or does it belong to Virginia? What about the issue of slavery and the inhumanity of slavery, which some states have banned at this point, but others, their economic health relies on free labor through slavery? And then there's Shays' Rebellion, a military veteran of the Revolutionary War turned farmer from Massachusetts. Daniel Shays leads a big-time uprising amongst other farmers in Massachusetts. It is eventually stopped, halted, but before it stopped and halted, it raises the question, what enforcement power is supposed to stop uprising within states? Should it be the state government, local governments, or should it be the federal government? And if it's the federal government, what military power is going to stop these state militias? Most importantly, Shays' rebellion was a sign of the frustration and the instability that people felt during this time in American history. The 13 states had created this thing called the Articles of Confederation, which was basically a list of loose guidelines of friendship between the 13 states. It was supposed to bind the states together, but it wasn't necessarily anything that gave any sort of power or backbone to a federal government. Every time that a new tension emerged within the states, it became clearer and clearer that the Articles of Confederation, it just wasn't really cutting it. And it was time to revise these articles. About 30 years before this, when this place called Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania was being constructed, a bell was ordered from London to hang in its tower. This bell had words from the Old Testament, the Christian and Jewish Bible, from the book of Leviticus. And the quote says, "Proclaim liberty through all of the land, and to all the inhabitants thereof." You've heard of this bell before. It has a small crack in it now. It's called the Liberty Bell. It hanging here in this Independence Hall in this tower as the delegates shuffle in to revise the Articles of Confederation in May. Remember, James Madison, the godfather of the Constitution, he had gathered into this fine state of Pennsylvania in the city of Philadelphia after a long journey from his home in Virginia to not just revise the articles, but his plan was to formulate some allies and some ideas for what sort of compromises needed to be made to create a brand new law-abiding document. So Madison knew he didn't just, want to revise the articles, but he wanted to create something new. As the delegates start to gather in Independence Hall, and they hear and they pass this bell hanging above them, many of them are reminded of that bell ringing when the Declaration of Independence was signed in this very same building years earlier. It is remarkable that this is a reunion of sorts for a handful of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, who are also the signers of the Constitution. When I say founding fathers, they're not just the founding fathers from one period of Declaration of Independence founding fathers and then another constitutional era. It's the same era of leading white, upper class, well-educated men. When they met to sign the Declaration of Independence, it was a different task. It took tremendous courage to pledge their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor, and to declare that a king had broken the bonds of their trust enough that they wanted to declare revolution for the entire country. But the Declaration of Independence was not a legal document. It was a moral statement of rights that everyone believed existed, and was a plea for help to Spain and to France, saying, hey, here's what Great Britain's doing wrong. Help us. Help us declare our independence. The Constitution is going to be a more difficult task. They had to create a practical framework for government, and there were fierce disagreements about how to structure power between the states and the federal government. Disagreements about how to structure power between the large states and the small states, the slave states and the handful of free states. So that required compromise, a C word that some of us aren't used to, especially when it comes to politics. It required patience, a P word that some of us aren't used to, especially when it comes to politics. It required commitment to public reason, an R word that some of us aren't used to when it comes to politics. Day number 1 of the Constitutional Convention is May 25th. It's not just during the long summer days where the work gets done in and outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. These men are also sharing rooms together at night in boarding houses that are just down the cobblestone streets from Independence Hall. And in the evenings, they're soaking up alcohol and food inside bars and restaurants, specifically at a place called City Tavern. There's one receipt that I told you guys about this past week, which still exists, that shows a farewell dinner held for George Washington at the City Tavern towards the end of the convention. That night, there was over 55 bottles of Madeira, 60 bottles of wine, 7 large bowls of alcoholic punch, 22 bottles of porter, beer, and a bunch of individual pints of beer, wine, and liquor. The list keeps on going. So basically, for 4 straight months, these men, away from their families, away from their wives, they're drinking and eating and sleeping and debating and sleeping and eating and drinking and debating over and over and over again every day, calling on the ideals of the revolution, passionately arguing their position in Independence Hall by day, then drunkenly hashing out their plans and debates in the taverns at night. They debated the issue of representation, which we talked about on Tuesday and should already be in your notes. They debated the issue of slavery in the very final days of the convention. The delegates essentially write into the Constitution a protection around the slave trade, saying that the new U.S. Congress can't ban it for at least 20 years, so that the earliest that the slave trade could be banned would be 1808. In many ways, including this into the Constitution is kind of just the founders saying we're going to kick the can down the road in terms of taking on this conversation and debate surrounding slavery. To not end the transatlantic slave trade or not even have a conversation about it until 1808 creates 2 decades of the institution of slavery to last. But there was a guarantee, at least, after that moment, after 1807, there could be a movement to end the transatlantic slave trade and then, therefore, perhaps make slavery illegal in these United States of America. And that's exactly what happens. The transatlantic slave trade does end in 1807. And so perhaps it was some of the framers understood that at this very moment, and this is the art of compromise, but at this very moment that outlawing slavery, putting it into the Constitution, that wasn't going to be possible if it meant actually getting this Constitution ratified. None of the framers must have been entirely happy with the outcome of the deliberations and debates when it comes to slavery. Those who are committed to the abolition of slavery understand that they've allowed the continuance of this grave moral injustice, but they think that it's necessary for the practical purposes of passing the Constitution. And the states where slavery is legal still at the time of the convention, mostly in the South, they don't get everything they want either. So it's an example that the most dramatic example in American history, perhaps, of both sides compromising on an issue they feel very strongly about, reaching a grave moral compromise in the eyes of history for the practical purpose of creating a working form of government. So we know for at least 20 years that the words, "we the people of the United States of America," that "we the people" is not going to include all people. And at this moment, enslaved people represented about 1/5 of the entire population. Somewhere around 700,000 men, women, and children were enslaved at the time of the convention. Enslaved in homes, enslaved in farms, enslaved in the city. These were men, women, and children who were treated sometimes with the most horrendous lack of regard for their bodies, for their souls, for having anything to do with the treating of them as human beings. So when we place men and women of color, specifically those who are enslaved, at the center of this story about the Constitution, we can't help but see the words "we the people" a little bit differently. This is a Constitution that really does nothing but perpetuate human bondage. I think one of the other things we must remember is that there were 55 men sitting in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania at this Constitutional Convention. There were no women. It's a document written by white, upper middle class, well-educated landowning men. And it's a document that one could argue is for, specifically, white, upper middle class, well-educated landowning men. And in that document, while white women were permitted to have citizenship, they clearly were not permitted to the same types of benefits that white men received from the Constitution. And the reality is that even impoverished white men were not protected by the Constitution in the same kinds of ways, meaning the ability to vote. We don't see the extension of the most important right in terms of airing your political grievances, sharing your political sophistication, the ability to vote. We don't see the extension of the right to vote to men, white men, regardless of income or land ownership, until really the middle of the 19th century, the 1830s or 1840s. And of course, we know that women aren't given the right to vote until 1920, an anniversary that we are proudly celebrating, the 100-year anniversary of this moment. And it would take another war and eventually the civil rights movement of the 20th century to close out some of the inequalities faced by black men and black women, many of which are still in place today. And this would be a struggle that men and women would engage in for decades after the Constitutional Convention. Besides representation, besides slavery, one of the other major debates at the Constitutional Convention was the issue of, does there need to be a Bill of Rights added in to this document? The big drama during the last weeks of the convention is whether or not these 10 amendments should be added to the original Constitution. Should we include these fundamental rights that the government's not allowed to infringe upon, including the rights of free speech, the rights against unreasonable searches and seizures, the right to trial by jury? I mean, most of the state constitutions at the time, they had a Bill of Rights. Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, big states, small states, they had bills of rights. Bill of Rights. So why doesn't the Constitution for the United States have a Bill of Rights when all the states seem to already have one? My friends, 13 delegates don't make it all the way until September. So from May until September, 13 delegates have walked away from that swelteringly hot Constitution Hall, Assembly Hall, Independence Hall. They ride away from Philadelphia before the signing ceremony begins, and a few who stay, 3 individuals who stay, they decide they're not ready to sign that Constitution because there's no Bill of Rights yet. In the end of the 55 original delegates, there are only 39 who step up to the piece of paper and on September 17th sign their names onto this piece of parchment. All students of the Constitution, liberal, conservative, all parties alike, agree that the framers wanted to create a mechanism to adopt the Constitution to changing times. And the basic mechanism they chose was the amendment process. There have been 17 amendments, and only 17 amendments that have later been added after the Bill of Rights were included over the course of 2 centuries. And they have profoundly shaped who we are as a nation. The abolition of slavery, women's right to vote, term limits for the presidency, the president's line of succession. It's a document that lives. It breathes. We see it change. It's wet cement. We see it amended, and we see it amended at different moments and different defining moments in American history. We're still working to move forward to be a more inclusive, we the people being all the people, no matter what your skin color, no matter what your religion, no matter what nation you were born into. We're still struggling with some of that language, and in some ways, while it's messy, it's dirty, it's gross, just like the parchment was before it was cleaned. The struggle does have results. Remember, the goal was to create a more perfect union, not a perfect union. 11,000 attempts have been made to amend the Constitution since the summer of 1787. 11,000 attempts, and of those 11,000 attempts, 27 of them have actually become official amendments. James Madison, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Ben Franklin, none of these men could anticipate exactly what the United States of America was going to become. They couldn't imagine all the battles and changes and heartbreaking setbacks and tearful victories that this document would usher in, or how the debates etched between its lines in 1787 would still be debated in 1887 and in 1967 and in 1987 and in 2020 and probably again in 2087. And yet they did know that this parchment was about to set forth a new kind of framework on this earth. A framework within which generation after generation of we, the people, push and pull and scrape and clean and tug towards trying to create a more perfect union.